Picking up where we left off in the last video, I currently have a brush here that has a pure white shape and this speckly grain that is going to be made up of a splat. And what you can see here is that I currently have a spacing of 10, which is going to be giving me a mark like this that looks more or less like a solid stroke. Now, what I want to do is I want to come back up here to a spacing of 100, which is going to give me these individual strokes. And I want to go ahead and talk a bit about the spacing jitter and the scatter. So in order to do that, I'm just going to come over here and clear this off. I'm going to hold down shift and I'm going to go ahead and make a reference mark, which is what you can see is we get a straight line and these guys are going to be stamped one after another with no overlap. Now, if I were to come over here and increase the spacing jitter to 100, you're going to see our stroke preview is going to show that there's going to be gaps that appear here. And if I go ahead and do the same thing, hold down shift, then go ahead and make a straight line mark, what you can see is that we're going to get randomization of the placement of the dab along the stroke. And it's going to be overlapping sometimes, and sometimes there's going to be a gap in between. And the reason why is because the jitter is a randomizer, but it's going to be randomizing along the distance of the stroke. Now, likewise, if I set this back to 0 and I come down here to scatter and I increase that to 100, then I hold down shift and I go ahead and make a straight line stroke, what you can see is that instead of being randomized on the stroke itself, it's going to be randomized up and down from the stroke, perpendicular to the stroke. And what you can see is that this allows us to scatter our dabs all over the place. And if I come over here and I clear this off and I increase both the spacing jitter and the scatter to 100, and I go ahead and make marks, you can see that I'm able to spray these guys down at random spacing. And this is going to create a very nice stamping technique. Now, this is very, very useful for creating complex sort of stamping, sponging type effects, splatter type of effects. This is a really, really useful effect that you get by increasing the spacing jitter and the scatter until you get what you want. And of course, if you want it more dense, all you need to do is simply reduce the spacing and it will become more dense in terms of spraying this down more rapidly. Now, currently we're getting this square outside edge, and the reason why is I currently have this white shape. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to come back over here to brushes and shapes, and I'm going to come back over here to the shape round, and then I'm going to go ahead and make a mark, and you can see that that ends up looking a lot more naturalistic. So again, I'll clear that off, and you can see that this is basically how you would make a splatter or a sponging type of brush, is you would basically have a low spacing, a high spacing jitter, and a high scatter in order to create that effect. Now that said, there is another effect that we can use, and I'll just go ahead and set these guys back to 0 and 0 and set this back to 100. And I want to talk about the smudge, and you can see it's currently grayed out. And the reason why is that I'm currently in a dry media. What I mean by that is that this media has no water slider that's associated with it. If I were to come over here and context click on this brush and say copy brush preset, and then come over here to the watercolors. And what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to go ahead and right click over here in the default category that I have. And I'm going to say paste. Now, if you're not seeing a default category, that's because you haven't created any additional groups. I have two groups that I've created here. You can see that they're currently twirled closed, so they won't be visible. But the idea is that you can create as many groups as you want. This is something that we saw in the stencils video when we were looking at stencils in the Essential series. But here's the basic that I've created. And you can see that it's different than the basic that I had over here in the airbrush in the fact that the airbrush has the smudge grayed out, but the watercolor has the smudge available. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the smudge does. I'm going to come over here and pause diffusion so that we don't see the diffusion. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it grayed out for right now. And I'm going to go ahead and just hold down the shift like I did before and make a straight line stroke. And we're going to see something that's very similar to what we saw with the airbrush. It's going to be duller, and the reason why is because currently we have a low loading. We could increase the loading to make this a denser stroke, something like that. I'm going to go ahead and hold down shift and make a similar mark, and you can see now we have a much denser mark. We're also going to see that we have more of a pronounced softness at the edges, and that's just a byproduct of the way that these dabs are set up. But the thing that I really want to show you here is going to be the smudge. So if I turn on the smudge, we're not going to see any real difference over here with the stroke preview. However, if I come over here and I do the same thing as I did before, where I hold down shift and I make a straight line stroke, we're going to get a completely different looking mark. Effectively, what the smudge is going to do is it's going to average the stroke over the distance of the stroke based on the characteristics of the stroke. And here we end up with something that looks very much like a bristle mark. And again, this is not something that you need to have a low spacing for. Now, if you lower the spacing, you'll end up with a denser looking mark. So if I lower that spacing, hold down shift and I go ahead and do this, you can see that we end up with a denser looking mark, but it's not really necessary. So if you're going to use the smudge feature, go ahead and set the spacing high rather than setting the spacing low. Now we could get a very similar type of effect by simply setting the spacing down to something very low. But if I go ahead and do that, what I want to point out to you is that it's not going to be the same. It's going to be a lot denser for one thing. But the other thing that it's going to do is it's also going to make the brush much slower. So it's definitely a good idea if you're in one of these categories that has a water characteristic to it, meaning the watercolor or the acrylic or the ink, then go ahead and try using the smudge because it's going to give you a very interesting brush mark that's going to be distinctly different than what you can get by simply lowering the spacing. And it's also going to work a little bit better when it comes to these different blend modes. So that's something that you do want to be aware of. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to turn the smudge on, and I want to show you one other characteristic of this smudge. So I'm going to come over here and increase the spacing jitter, and I'm going to go ahead and hold down shift and make a similar mark as I did before. And you're going to see that we don't see much of a difference here in terms of the spacing jitter. But if I come over here and I increase the scatter instead, so I'm going to go ahead and hold down shift, and I'm going to go ahead and make a mark. What you're going to see is that now we get a distinctly different mark. And the reason why is because that randomization that was going above and below the stroke is going to be the point at which these guys are being averaged in between. So we end up with a very interesting looking type of mark. And that's something that you could definitely leverage to make an interesting style of brush. So when you're thinking about what you get with the smudge, don't forget that it also works with the scatter and it does take some of the spacing into account. But my advice would be if you're going to use the smudge, keep the spacing set high because that's going to tend to give you better looking results. Now that said, I'm going to come back over here to the airbrush. I'm going to go ahead and stay with this one that we have here. And I'm going to go ahead and clear off this layer. And we'll pick up from this point in the next video.